Hello and welcome to episode 18 of My Friend the Rainbow Circle. I'm experimenting with new spots to shoot. This opening is sounding a little bit like Comic Tropes opening. Um, One of my favorite shows on YouTube, Comic Tropes. I kind of like that weird spooky glow. But I'm waiting in line to pick up my son, and I usually have lots of extra time waiting in line. But speaking of experimentation, this is a lot like a comic strip opening. But speaking of experimentation, I was thinking about experimentation because episode 18 reminds me of this book I was writing called 18 Molochs, which reminds me of two types of experimentation that are really relevant and interesting to talk about for me. I've been obsessed with this Kafka story called 11 Sons. And 11 Sons is a list story. It's a list story, which is not a very good title. I mean, not a very good genre name. List story. It's really it's just this list of 11 sons, just the narrator describing 11 sons. And I've been playing around with that structure for years. Like one of my stories, it's book length now, but it's not finished, and it might never be finished. I don't know. But it's called 18 Molochs, which is a riff on the Molochs from part 2 of Howl by Allen Ginsberg. And Howl was pretty significant to me personally because I had a dream about it before I ever knew anything about Allen Ginsberg. I had a dream. He visited me in a dream dressed as Blue Electric Superman. And he told me about the 18 Molochs. I'd never heard of Howl at that point. But I was obsessed with this dream. And then later I heard Howl. And I heard the Molochs in part 2. So that's been a fixation. And I'm afraid I've failed the Blue Electric Superman spirit of Allen Ginsberg. I feel like I sound crazy sometimes when I talk about these things. But that's being an artist, I guess. But the list story brings up a significant issue because just the nature of experimentation, and it links into a lot of what I've been saying already, just the nature of experimentation. Partly what I've been saying in the last few episodes is the problematic structure of the workshop system. One of the problems is it doesn't welcome in experimental forms. So if I came into and I did this with workshops, I would bring in experimental structures every once in a while. And there's really in the structure of the workshop itself, there's really no way to deal with that. Whereas your standard structure of a story is a lot easier to deal with, just in my experience. And one of the cognitive biases that I talked about, the storytelling fallacy, which is another bad name. The storytelling fallacy basically meaning that if you encounter something you're unfamiliar with, the first response is that you don't like it, whereas the actual response is just that you're not familiar with it. But one of the really important processes in understanding storytelling is to recognize the familiarity threshold. If you boil down the most essential thing happening in the structure of a story as the stimulation at the core, the visceral stimulation being the most significant thing to achieve and optimize access to, working against the destimulating force that, if you encounter something stimulating, there's an attraction to it and a counter force that strives to destimulate it. And that's true with anything novel, anything different. So the reason the storytelling fallacy plays out, and people come up with these false stories about why they dislike something, when in fact it's just because it's new. The novelty of the thing is unfamiliar and discomforting. And so they strive for comfort. That striving for comfort causes the reader or the reviewer or the workshop person, whatever, to strive for something familiar like a category or to reject it. A category might be that it's bad, or a category might be it belongs in this genre. It changes the lighting tremendously. This is fascinating. One great thing about experimentation is you discover things that you like or you dislike, like the weird lighting changes here. I like the weird lighting changes. It's kind of spooky, dark and spooky, bright, dark. But something that's different and experimental. If if I submitted a list poem or a list story like 11 Suns, what do you do with 11 Suns? Or any one of Kafka's stories. All of them are experimental in structure, even if that aspect of it gets taken for granted and is underdeveloped in the analysis of it. Like I mentioned, a Hunger Artist, which is one of my favorites to look at with POV. One of the entirely wrong things in my MFA that was emphasized just constantly for some reason was the need to maintain a consistent POV throughout a text, throughout a story, which is nonsense, complete nonsense. It's one of those things that a young writer might do it unconsciously. The actual advice is be conscious of your POV shifting. But if you look at just an amazing story like A Hunger Artist, it starts off in objective third with a lot of distance, and then it just slowly collapses as the main character is collapsing. It's just a brilliant use of POV. Or if you look at Sorrows of a Family Man, which is one of my favorite stories of all time, it has 4 different POVs in one page. So, it's a very experimental approach, but they're all brilliant stories. And the excuse for that, and it's such a disingenuous argument in bad faith. You have to know the rules to break them. Please don't ever tell people that. If you have to know the rules to break them, there shouldn't be rules. That's just a bad way of even framing it to begin with. So what's much better is recognizing the forces at play. So if you look at something like Sorrows of a Family Man, how does it actually succeed in stimulating the audience? Does the POV shifting enhance or detract from access to the visceral stimulation at the core? Does it play into the destimulating force, or does it play into the stimulating force? So somebody who wants just a regular structure with a story is comforted with the familiarity of a regular structure for a story. That's part of the force that plays into the stimulation, the forces of stimulation within the story. So if you compare, just Sorrows of a Family Man or 11 Suns to any sort of normally structured story, then someone who has a high threshold for novelty might find the normal structured story so destimulating that it becomes uninteresting, or might find the novelty of the structure in Sorrows of a Family Man more stimulating. I have a very high threshold for novelty. I prefer novelty. But someone with a low threshold will reject a story like Sorrows of a Family Man and identify the false reason why they claim that it's quote-unquote bad. It's bad because it breaks these quote-unquote rules, which is just entirely untrue. So that's a lot of the, goes back to a lot of the same logic flaws of workshops and the whole workshop system and creative writing textbooks and things like that. It's just not designed to support novel forms. And when it does work to support novel forms, that's in spite of the structure of the system. You have plenty of workshop leaders who will say, I'm not against experimental forms. You just, you're conscientious of the experimental forms within the structure of the workshop system. But that's running counter to the detrimental forces of the structure of the workshop system itself. And I've had one of my worst workshop leaders started off by talking about Donald Bartlemay stories. But I think it functions more as, it seems to me, I don't know, but it seems to function more as moral licensing, which essentially tokenism, where someone might support the conformist forces of the workshop system itself and reinforce the conformity that's intrinsic to the workshop system, but then put Donald Barthelme on the reading list as moral licensing. Moral licensing just meaning because I have this one example of that shows that I'm not a conformist, that gives me the license to be a conformist, and to reinforce conformity. And I have a lot of examples just of essentially a token experimental artist. I don't. Donald Barthelme is another story for me. It's sort of like Pynchon, where those are writers you think I would like, but I don't really, for complicated reasons. George Saunders being another one. George Saunders is definitely the token experimental guy that everybody loves because he's the ultra workshop guy. I read an article a while ago that said where George Saunders said a lot of nonsense things, nothing personal to George Saunders, but he doesn't seem to know what he's talking about. Don't get me started on Neil Gaiman not knowing what he's talking about. That's a whole other video. But George Saunders said the reason specificity works in a story is a mystery. My first response was, it's not actually a mystery. There are other things that are mysteries. That's not a mystery. See other videos to explain why specificity works. Specificity works, if you're talking about show don't tell, one of my most hated cliches, it works because the senses tie you more closely to the visceral core. I don't have the rainbow circle with me, but the center of the rainbow circle, this sense imagery ties you more closely to the center of the rainbow circle because it's more bodily and visceral. There, solved the mystery. That's not the mystery. That's not the best mystery to call a mystery. But anyway, so I have problems with a lot of the token experimental writers who you hold up as, here's proof that I'm not a conformist. I teach George Saunders. I had a very, very nice workshop leader who thought I would like George Saunders. I'll leave this person anonymous. Who just swore I would love George Saunders, and I hated George Saunders. And I feel bad about that. There's a lot of guilt there. I had lots and lots of kind people in workshops, and I hate to bash them, but just the system is really, really bad. But my point is, he functions as a token that gives people license to be conformist, very frequently. But what was my point? Oh, just before I run out of time, because I am in line here. One of my main points, I think the list story, and I've experimented with the list story a lot. I have a whole series of stories called 1111 stories, where ideally, by the time I get done with these, I'll have 121 stories. But they're things like, one of my mystery novels, the whole series of my 3 mystery novels started as 11 beginnings of mystery novels, and I just did absurd mystery novels. Just the opening lines, basically, of absurd mystery novels. Stuff like that. And I did one called 40 Doe, which is about 40 different doe who were born with deformities and things like that. And I tried to do one every day, and, it was sort of as a challenge. List stories function effectively as interesting challenges. Theme and variation. Those are probably the main ones. And 18 Molochs, about just 18 different characters named Moloch, who have, it's a whole complicated thing. But a big part of the inspiration comes from Ginsberg himself, and I think the Anaphora that you see in Howl is a perfect example of how experimentation could and should work effectively. It could work in the micro terms as just exercise. A lot of what workshops should really encourage, and it's kind of hot here, I am sweating. A lot of what workshops really should encourage in creative writing, books and things like that, what they do positively is what I call 10,000 hoursing, just meaning essentially exercising a muscle. The critique itself is mostly BS, but the exercising of the muscle is what actually ends up resulting in positive outcomes. So experiments can work to exercise the muscle. They can work to trigger the stimulation of novelty itself, and that's a pretty good positive effective thing that they can do. But they can also break new ground, and the list story, which is a terrible name for a genre, but the list story could end up being a genre, and a perfect example of how that did actually work is with Ginsberg with the Anaphora poems. So if you look at something like Howl, where the first section, I am moving, hold on. The first section, each line starts who, the second section, each line starts Moloch, and the third section starts I'm with you in Rockland. That's called an Anaphora. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. I've been reading about it and studying it for years and never really heard anyone say it. So may I be mispronouncing that completely. But he adapted that, of course, from Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman adapted that from the Bible, from Beatitudes, and things like, lots of different parts of the Bible, but real basic examples in the Beatitudes. Blessed are they who, blessed are they who. And so every once in a while you would have a writer who adapts that particular structure, and it was a different structure. In Ginsberg's time, there was a new emphasis on formal structure, so he was rebellious against the formal structure at the time. It goes in cycles, of course. Rhyme and meter became more popular in Ginsberg's time, and he broke away from that with breath stop lineation and anaphora and things like that. It was experimental and different. It was exciting. It was, when you first read it, it created this whole sensation, and it became this huge popular thing. And that's another myth about experimentation, that it's always on the outside. A lot of the times, really experimental things can be really popular in their times, and Howl was definitely one of those. But if you go to any poetry reading at all, what you're going to hear very frequently is anaphora poetry. So a groundbreaking formal experiment can turn into just a brand new form, just a brand new possibility. And I think that's one of the things that experiment gives us, is exercise of the muscle within the soul that allows us to write. But another one is just a new possibility. And I think a lot of the problematic things that come with writing advice tends to be taking something that is actually an option and not a rule, something that is a possibility that can improve your story. If you're struggling with the story, try applying show don't tell to it. That might help. Show don't tell is not a rule. It's not an absolute. It's just something that could help. An experimental form is not an absolute. It's something that could help. It could spice up your story. But treating it as a rule is the problem. So if you break new ground and create anaphora poetry, list poetry, you can, in 50 years, you can have every other poem at a poetry reading be the structural imitation of Ginsberg imitating Whitman, imitating the Bible. And it can just be an option. Or it could just be, something to exercise your mind. And there's the whole naming of genres is just is a rant in and of itself. I don't want to rant. I want to be helpful. But the naming of genres, a lot of experimental genres get just really terrible names. I think there should be a better name than list story. Like postmodernism, a lot of the experimental people get lumped into postmodernism. I would say Kafka is a postmodernist, but that name is so terrible that it really identifies a particular time period. Bartlemy and Pynchon and all them are postmodernists, and they fit in with the time period. But it's a pattern that the conformist genres in favor, like literary fiction and realism, get these very positive names, whereas the outsider sort of genres, like postmodernism, get terrible names. Even magical realism, which is technically positive, still seems like a subgenre of realism, which is ridiculous. But science fiction, one of the most inaccurate names possible. Fantasy, you could say it's positive, but it's still a little bit belittling. But anyway, that's a whole rant for another day. But try a list story. If I was writing a book, I would say here's a type of story you could do, and then that might be helpful. That might be the only thing helpful, and then I'll list nonsense rules and pretend like they're universal. But I think we're about to move. See you next time on My Friend the Rainbow Circle. Have a good day.